It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you. Before I came over today, I went into our catalog for the Rare Book Library to see, did we have anything by Emanuel Swedenborg? And I found that we had 3 full pages worth of rare books by Emanuel Swedenborg from obviously the 18th century through. So that amounts to about 60 titles in various languages, of course Latin being the predominant ones from the 18th century. So he's well represented in the university catalog for early materials. So come down and see it. Anyway, as I'm sure you are very well aware, it was exactly 500 years ago on last Halloween that the Augustinian friar Martin Luther wrote and published his 95 Theses. Now, the story goes, and that's the beginning of the Reformation, technically. And I'm going to say the Reformation, but always bear in mind there wasn't one Reformation. There were numerous Reformations throughout this period that we're going to be talking about, but it's just easier to say the Reformation. Now, the story goes that he wrote out a set of 95 propositions, as I'm sure you know, by hand, and he intended that these were going to be the basis for an academic debate, which really was the normal practice in the Middle Ages. That's what you did when you wanted to get a discussion going. And tradition says that he posted them to the chapel door of Wittenberg Castle. Now, these 95 theses, as I'm sure you're probably aware, they questioned certain doctrines and practices of late medieval Christianity, especially the purchase of indulgences, which I'll come back to in a moment. And by doing this, Luther hoped that he was going to inspire a vigorous debate among his fellow scholars and churchmen. It's highly unlikely, however, that he ever intended to begin the social upheaval that we today call the Protestant Reformation. He thought he was just helping the church. Even the story that I've just described of Luther nailing these theses to the chapel door there at Wittenberg, that in itself is a matter for debate, because the story actually comes from one of Luther's friends. And he told the story many years after Luther had died. Now, that's an event that is so significant that if Luther had actually done this, chances are he would have told us that himself, but he doesn't. But it is one of his friends that does say so, so the tradition remains. Whether that happened or not, what we do know is that it was on the 31st of October, 1517, that Luther wrote to his religious superiors, and in that letter he enclosed his 95 theses, so they are real, these 95 arguments with a letter, and he intended them as points for future discussion. But for whatever reason, those theses that he wrote caught the popular imagination very quickly. And within weeks, there were printed forms of the 95 Theses circulating all around Germany, or the German-speaking territories, and fairly quickly after that, beyond the Germanic-speaking territories. We know, for example, that the 95 Theses were being debated at Cambridge in 1518. So that shows you how quickly they made their way from Wittenberg to the British Isles. There's an old adage that goes, no printing, no Reformation. What that saying recognizes was that the Protestant Reformation was in fact the very first revolution that took place as a result of the world-altering invention called movable type printing press. Of course, there had been movable type in the Eastern world, in China and in Korea, since about the 11th century, in terms of clay movable type. In the West, Gutenberg, as you probably are aware, very well aware, invented his printing press about the year 1450. Now, the invention of the printing press owes its origin in no small way to the very flashpoint that started the whole Reformation in the first place, the indulgences that Luther hated so much. Now, in Roman Catholic tradition, you may be aware, may not be aware, in Roman Catholic tradition, indulgences were considered a means of reducing the length or amount of punishment that one had to undergo for sins that were committed in this life. Now, in the late Middle Ages, this remission was primarily associated with the commutation of time that a soul would spend in purgatory, a doctrine, as I'm sure you're well aware, is not explicitly found in the Scriptures. Now, generally speaking, what that form took was you had to perform certain prayers or pious works in order to obtain the indulgence. But you could also do this, you could replace that effort by a simple financial donation to the church or to one of its projects. So if you paid a substantial amount of money towards, for example, the ongoing wars against the Turks, you could get 100 years off of your time in purgatory. I mean, even today, I mean, when the bishops and the theologians of the Catholic Church talk about it now, there is a realization, this whole idea of purgatory was that it was a temporal thing. Well, of course, now there's the acknowledgement that once you die, there is no time anymore. So giving a temporal remission doesn't really mean anything. At the time, however, it wasn't quite that refined. So as I say, give money to fighting the Muslim Turks, 100 years off purgatory. Or what really, really angered Luther was if you gave money towards the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which admittedly needed to be rebuilt, it was a mess, you could get 200, 300, 400 years off of your sentence. So as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs, was the old rhyme. The problem for Luther was that he had come to believe that we are saved not by anything that we do, but only, of course, by faith in Christ alone, and particularly in faith in his death and his resurrection. So indulgences then, from Luther's point of view now, made absolutely no sense. But until he came along, those indulgences, they were like gold to many, many people, including Luther. Luther at one point, when he is a younger man, went down to Rome, and he writes, he wished his parents were dead because he could have gotten so many indulgences for them if they were gone by that point, which is not a particularly filial sentiment, I think, but at any rate, that tells us that even he believed all this. Now, until Gutenberg appeared on the scene, those treasured and much desired indulgences, one of which you are looking at here, the certificates all had to be written out by hand over and over and over again. Of course, that's a very time-consuming effort. And then somewhere around the year 1440, so before the invention of the printing press, Gutenberg, who was a metal worker by trade, he realized that he could simplify this whole process of tedious hand copying of the indulgences by engraving a metal plate with all of the words, but then leaving a blank on it so you could just insert the name and the amount of money that was being paid. You could do that by hand. So this really made things much, much easier for everybody. What he created was essentially a stamp. And with it, indulgence certificates could now be churned out in no time by the thousands, which means more money that you're able to bring into the church's coffers. It was this idea of the indulgence stamp then, that's what led Gutenberg shortly thereafter to the idea of the printing press, using individual pieces of movable type rather than one single plate. You could rearrange that type into words, and you could create all sorts of documents besides indulgences. And so, thanks to these, the printing press was born. So the printing and selling of indulgence certificates, whatever we may think about it, it had a good effect at one point in the end. It was also a very profitable exercise for many parties, not the least of which were the printers themselves. Luther, who generally believed in the positive aspects of the printing press, he wrote, however, about the spiritual dangers that were associated with this particular trade, printing indulgences. And in a letter dated the 5th of March, 1518, he expressed his very deep regret that the new printing technology had been co-opted in this way. But you can imagine there were a lot of printers that were not happy when Luther came along and said, no more indulgences. So in a way, you can see it's not really surprising that the Reformation has actually been called Gutenberg's child. It's an acknowledgement that without the printing press, the official texts and the proclamations of the Catholic Church, as well as the new ideas from the Protestant reformers, they would never have traveled as far and as fast and as wide as they actually did. It's important to realize that many of the ideas that Luther and the other reformers from around his period that they came up with, they were not original to them. In the 14th century, for example, you had this man, John Wycliffe, and his followers, known as the Lollards, and they were in England. Now, they had been pushing for the Bible to be translated into English and to hold liturgical services in English so that everyone could participate more fully. This, however, was not something that the English crown wanted at the time, at all. And although Wycliffe himself died a natural death, he was actually condemned posthumously. His dead body was dug up, and it was burned at the stake, and his ashes were scattered in the River Swift as a heretic. At the beginning of the 15th century, this man, another one you may recognize, the Bohemian priest Jan Hus, he went about strongly advocating for the priesthood of all believers and for something as simple as the reception of the cup during Holy Communion by all of the faithful and not just the clergy. Well, for his efforts and for holding other positions that were deemed Wycliffite, as they were called at the time, he was burned at the stake during the Council of Constance in 1415. Now, the interesting thing is that all of these ideas, whether they were Wycliffe's or Huss's, they would all be taken up again by Martin Luther and his friends in the 16th and 17th centuries. Why were they successful? And why are they remembered today as the founders of the Reformation when these proto-reformers, Wycliffe and Huss, generally have been forgotten? Well, in no small part, it was because Luther and his friends understood the power of the printing press. In the days of Wycliffe and Huss, you have to remember, the laborious process of writing out manuscripts by hand, that meant that fewer copies of their ideas actually circulated among those who could actually read. In addition, those very few copies that were made were more easily seized and destroyed by persons in authority, meaning that those early calls for reform, they actually remained fairly restricted to small and closed communities. With Gutenberg now, the whole world changes. He began a revolution that, in fact, we are still very much the heirs to today, with our ability now to transmit information in the blink of an eye. That began with Gutenberg. Gutenberg could only have dreamt, however, of the power that we have today. Luther, however, recognized the great potential of the press, and that was his genius. He knew how to harness the power of it. During one of his so-called table talks, and these were conversations that took place during informal get-togethers, often around a shared meal, but during which Luther expressed some very, very important insights. One day Luther said this. He said, "Printing is God's ultimate and greatest gift. Indeed, it is through printing that God wants the whole world, to the ends of the earth, to know the roots of true religion and wants to transmit it in every language. Printing is the last flickering of the flame that glows before the end of this world." Now, I don't think that Luther was speaking apocalyptically there, even though it sounds a little bit like that. I believe that he realized, and was one of the few that realized, that he was living at the exact moment when the medieval world was going to pass away and the modern world was going to be born. You see, the printing press, when it was combined with the Reformation, was going to make literacy a much more important commodity than it had ever been in the past. In the autumn of 1517, it's estimated that literacy approached about 30% in urban areas and about 5% in rural. Now, although the vast majority of the population could not yet read, the presses of Europe were now beginning to churn out thousands and thousands of copies of sermons and pamphlets and Bibles and commentaries. And these were finding their ways into the hands of people who indeed actually were now literate. Bit by bit, that printed word was now being proclaimed from pulpits, but it was also being read and shared in inns and tap rooms. And as that happened, the ideas both of the reformers and of the representatives of the traditional Catholic Church were now being more widely heard, even if they were not being individually universally read. At the same point, this same period, topical woodcut caricatures, like the ones that you're looking at here, this is the beginning of political cartooning. These began to appear, and they were open to the interpretation of anyone, whether they were literate or illiterate or not, alike. It didn't make any difference whether you could read or not. You could look at this and you could make sense of it. So Luther's comment during his table talk that printing was the last flickering of the flame before the end of the world was not apocalyptic. It was foresight. It was the keen insight of a man who understood that the printed word was going to become one of the most important instruments lighting the way into the modern world. Now, before we get into any individual examples of formats of printing and some significant titles that actually helped to spread the ideas of the Reformation, there are a few refinements to this idea of no printing, no Reformation that we have to consider if the historical context for the movement that we call the Reformation is going to be understood. The first is that while the Reformation as it came to pass could not have happened without the invention of the printing press, the printing press alone cannot be considered solely responsible for the Reformation either. Some people have tried to argue that. Other factors that contributed and were enormously important as well. The rise of the academic movement known as humanism was one of these, and it's best represented by this man, Desiderius Erasmus. Humanism began to emerge at the beginning of the 15th century, and it was an effort by Christian scholars to get back to the roots of Christianity, particularly to the Hebrew and the Greek scriptures, as well as to the writings of the church fathers. These had fallen somewhat into neglect through the Middle Ages, and the humanists, they were seeking to revive these sources to better understand what the character of primitive Christianity might have looked like. Besides humanism, there was also at this period a revival in preaching, often in the vernacular, which was a new thing, and not just in Latin. So this was a new thing as well, and that was going to have an effect. There was also a growth in popular devotions that were independent of the church's official liturgies. For example, the recitation of the rosary by individual people at home. Sometimes, oftentimes, led by lay people. Well, what this did, even something as pious an act as the recitation of the rosary, began to have people start questioning the intermediary character of an ordained priesthood. If I can say my prayers at home on my own, do I need the priest at the church to intercede on my behalf? There was also much greater trade and movement all around Europe, which meant that social interaction and exchange of ideas, that was getting to be far more common. So people were hearing about what was happening in Bohemia. People were hearing what was happening in Spain. And they were starting to make sense of this in different ways. And finally, and certainly not least of all these, this is the period when the modern nation states of Europe are just starting to emerge. And what's going to happen as a result of that is that the unity of what we call Christendom becomes fractured. These new local sovereign governments would not only contribute to, but more importantly, they would also take advantage of the Reformation controversies. Think of Henry VIII, for example, in order to push forward their own national agenda. So while the printing press can't be solely credited with the massive revolution that occurred in Europe in the 16th century, it certainly made that revolution a lot easier. But the adage, no printing press, no Reformation, can also be turned on its head. In many cases, it was also a matter of no Reformation, no printing press, meaning that the printing press industry actually got established in some places only after the Reformation had begun. Presses, for example, were established in numerous towns like Ingolstadt, Stuttgart, Regensburg, Jena, only after the Reformation had been instituted in those places. The Jesuits, on the Catholic side, who were initially hesitant about the power of the printing press, they didn't trust it at first. They eventually realized that if they could harness it for propaganda purposes as well. And so they established the first printing presses at places like Seville, Valladolid, and throughout Normandy. Luther's hometown that you see here, Wittenberg, is an excellent example that shows the growth of the print industry immediately following the Reformation in that city. Now think about this. In 1502, there was only one printing press in this town, in Wittenberg, and it had been set up to serve the newly established university there. 5 printers would open their shops and close them between 1502 and 1516. There just wasn't enough business. Then Luther comes along. And all of a sudden, there was a demand for books being printed out of Wittenberg, and the print trade boomed in his hometown. In the end, the little town of Wittenberg, which only had a population of about 200 in 1517 when Luther nailed those theses, would publish more books in the course of the entire 16th century than any other German town. That's the power of the Reformation. So while there were indeed other factors that affected and helped to promote the ideas of both the Protestant and the Catholic Reformations that began 500 years ago, the printing press, we have to admit, was at the forefront. And of course, this is what we tend to think of when we think about the mighty tomes that were produced by Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and all these people. Often overlooked in the discussion, however, is the role of something much more important than these big books. And that's the pamphlet, the role of the humble pamphlet. This is the very first time that the pamphlet appears as a separate literary genre. The Reformation pamphlet was not merely a neutral vehicle for spreading information. It actually helped to excite the discussions, the debates of the period themselves. They were referred to as brief, blunt, and vulgar, which I think is a wonderful way of thinking of them. And they were intended for the use of the unsophisticated and often intended for the use of the confused. But they became the major tool by those who sought to gain the religious loyalties of large numbers of people. Unlike large books that could take weeks and months to print, let alone read, pamphlets could be prepared and printed in a matter of days, and they could be distributed very easily by hawkers and vendors at pretty cheap prices, usually less than the equivalent of a penny. It's estimated that the publication of a 16-page pamphlet in 1520, 1521 could be accomplished in 2 days, meaning that Luther could give an idea from the pulpit on a Sunday afternoon, it could be typeset on Monday morning, it could be printed by Monday afternoon, it would be on the street by Tuesday. This is the Twitter of the Reformation. And I mean that seriously, because that is the immediacy with which this information is getting out into the public hands. And that's the thing that changes the course of the Reformation. That information is getting out really, really fast. The Germans call these, we call them pamphlets, which I think is a really boring term. The Germans call them Flugschriften, which means flying writing, which I think is a much more attractive word than, pamphlet. But anyway, these were the things that fueled the Reformation. The pamphlet also did something else. The pamphlet also changed the linguistic dynamic of the Reformation as well. In 1517, there were only 13 pamphlets printed in German. 7 years later, there were 299. That represents a 2,300% increase. The Protestants were particularly clever about this. They understood that if you wanted to win over people's hearts, you have to do it in their own language. Now, everyone agreed Latin was going to remain the language of scholarly discussion. It had to, because you had too many various linguistics groups to deal with. But if you wanted to gain popular support, you had to start churning stuff out in French, in English, in Dutch, in German, in Italian, in short, in all of the modern languages of 16th century Europe. Now, one of the side effects of this, and it's one of the side effects that we are still dealing with today, is that this had the effect of reinforcing nationalism, and sometimes petty nationalism that went along with it. Nationalism that was more important sometimes than religion, for better or for worse. But it is one side effect of all this. Now, the Catholic community, on the other hand, they were slower off the mark, or at least they had a different way of approaching this crisis. For example, between the years 1520 and 1530, it's estimated that Protestant printing outstripped Catholic printing by a ratio of 5-1. So the Protestants were on top of this pretty quickly. We also know that the Protestants were printing 85% of their publications in the vernacular language. Catholics were printing 85% of theirs in Latin. So it's not getting into the hands of the ordinary people. But what that tells us is two different approaches to how the Reformation was going to unfold. Those statistics prove that the Protestants, they had decided that they were going to target the broad base of the population, while the Catholics, they were going to, by using Latin, they had another strategy. They were going to target teachers, clerics, leaders of government, anyone who had Latin as the base. So they were going for the authority. The Protestants were going for the base. Now, as I've mentioned, the intersection between the invention of movable type printing press and the Reformation and the rise of the modern nation state are in many ways the story behind the story. I've also noted already how printing in German-speaking countries rapidly expanded as a result of Luther. But what about elsewhere where the Reformation was catching on? Well, among the most important places where printing emerged as a major industry because of the Reformation was what we today call Switzerland, or the territories that bordered along the Swiss cantons. As individual cities declared themselves for the Reformation, they became magnets for printers, important economic centers as a result of this. People who were fleeing from the Catholic territories to be able to live and work in freedom. And so you have cities like Strasbourg, Basel, Geneva. These become the essential hubs for printing of specifically Protestant materials. Geneva, for example, it officially declared itself a Protestant city in May of 1536. The first Protestant printer arrived within months of that, about the same time that Calvin did. 25 years later, Geneva had 130 Protestant printers in the city, making it one of the most important of all of the Protestant printing centers in the world. Now, we associate John Calvin most closely with Geneva, but he originally considered Strasbourg to be the most important place to do his printing, and that's where he would send his Latin materials for printing. He trusted the printers at Strasbourg for that. The problem was that Catholics and Protestants in Strasbourg kept fighting over who was going to have control of the city. A number of Calvin's manuscripts got destroyed in all of this, some of which was probably a good idea given some of the things that Calvin had written, but it ended up being a situation where he realized this was untenable. He couldn't have anything to do with Strasbourg anymore. Basel, on the other hand, it became very popular with printers because it had a general sense of religious tolerance in the city, at least for varieties of Protestants, not necessarily for Catholics. Tolerance, however, was not a mark of all Protestant communities at this time. And this was particularly evident in the city that we're looking at here, in Zurich. The Reformation unfolded in a much, much more radical way in Zurich than it did elsewhere in the Swiss cantons, owing in no small part to the thought and actions of this gentleman that you see here, a very militant reformer by the name of Ulrich Zwingli, who had been appointed pastor of Zurich in 1519. Now, as at Geneva, a lot of printers moved into Zurich so that they could practice their Protestant faith, but also their trade and freedom. And their ideas resonated with Zwingli's more radical ideas in many cases. There was a cost associated with that decision, however, because Zurich found itself on the outs, not only with the Catholic Church, but with Martin Luther. Religious texts that were printed in Zurich were routinely blocked from entering into both Catholic and Lutheran territories, owing, among other things, to Zurich's rejection of the doctrine of the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Now, while Luther and the Roman Catholic Church disagreed about exactly how Christ was present in the Eucharist, both believed that he was truly present in it. Zwingli, however, he had the idea that the Eucharist was nothing more than a memorial, that there was no presence, a true presence in the same sense that Luther had maintained. So suspicion was cast over everything that came out of Zurich, not just stuff about the Eucharist. And then add to that fact the general radicalness of Zwingli's Reformation, that put everything that came out of the city under suspicion. The books coming out of Zurich then were blocked everywhere. You couldn't get into German territories, you couldn't get into the French territories, you couldn't get in. And so what the very clever Zurich printers started to do was they would craft their title page, but instead of having Zurich on it at the bottom, they would put Paris, or they would put Rome, or they would put some other place. And that way they would be able to get the books into the territories where they would, if they hadn't done that, they would have been financially ruined. Now, the role of the printing press in the English Reformation is the most complicated, but in many ways it's the most interesting, at least for English speakers. The mess that was the English Reformation also messed up the lives of English Catholic and Protestant printers big time, depending on who it was that sat on the throne at any given moment. We have to begin by understanding that from the days of John Wycliffe in the 14th century, there had been this undercurrent of dissatisfaction present in certain corners of the English church, but by no means in all parts of the English church. The evidence shows that in the first half of the 16th century, most of the English faithful, they simply took the practices and the pieties and the structures of the late medieval Catholic Church for granted. It was part and parcel of living. When the break with Rome finally occurred, with the passage of the Act of Supremacy by Henry VIII in November of 1534, and an independent Church of England was constituted, but we have to remember that church was essentially conservative in nature, meaning that strictly speaking, it was not Lutheran. It certainly wasn't Lutheran. but neither was it reformed in character. When Henry VIII's son, Edward, ascended to the throne while he was still a child, effectively, he was strongly influenced by the clergy and courtiers who were particularly sympathetic to Calvin, not Luther. And this exerted a much greater influence over the evolution of the church's liturgy, doctrine, and customs than had certainly been the case during the reign of Henry VIII. Edward, as I'm sure we all know, he didn't last very long. 6 years was his reign, long enough, however, to publish the first Book of Common Prayer in 1549. When he died, of course, his half-sister, Mary I, came to the throne, and she effectively returned England to the Roman Catholic fold for the next 5 years, until her death in 1558. Then, of course, you then have the reign of her half-sister, Elizabeth I, and that saw the restoration of the Church of England, but according to the Queen's pragmatic philosophy of what she called the via media. That meant a form of church government that somehow was able to walk between Roman Catholicism and the Genevan reforms. The problem was that with each and every change in monarch, new and onerous challenges were being faced by members of the print trade. Books that had been considered perfectly orthodox only at the end of one reign, Henry's reign, such as this one that you're looking at here, a page from the Golden Legend that tells the story of Thomas Becket, printed in 1527, becomes heretical by the end of the reign. And here you can see this one on the right is the Fisher's copy, and you can see that the story of Thomas Becket has been blacked out completely because Henry, of course, hated Thomas Becket. And someone later on, it's one of the things I love about censored books. This page, if you look at it, has been bleached again so that people can see what the text is underneath it. The problem was that books that were Catholic, prayer books, Bibles, whatever it was, that were acceptable under Mary were no longer acceptable under Elizabeth. And for printers, this was particularly problematic because their names were on those pages. It wasn't as though they could say, I had nothing to do with it. And they all got then, as the spiritual whiplash went on from reign to reign in England, it was a very, very unsettling and very dangerous time to live as a printer in Great Britain. The censorship of religious books in the English-speaking world, it can be traced back to Archbishop Thomas Arundel. He put down this document called the Constitutions in 1409. And this piece of legislation was written in reaction to the threat that was posed by our friend Wycliffe that I talked about earlier. What this Constitution said was that anyone who translated any portion of the Bible into English was automatically excommunicate and was subject to execution. This was Henry IV, and it was the law that remained into Henry VIII's reign. When Luther's books began to appear on the scene in England around the year 1520, the king and the establishment in England, they were outraged. And so the Bishop of London called all the printers together at St. Paul's Churchyard in October 1524, and he told them, you are not to import any books from Germany from this point on, nor are you to distribute any that you already have. So what did that do? It made a flourishing trade in Protestant books. That's always the way that if you want to get people to read something, you ban it. That's the way you do. Just to give a small sense, however, of what the various changes in the regime could have, the effect it could have on the printing industry. When Henry's son, Edward VI, died in July 1553, there were 17 presses in London. 2 months into the reign of his sister, Mary I, only 8 were left. That's how quickly it all fell apart as the Protestant printers fled to the relative safety of the continent, or they just shut down their business. Queen Elizabeth, she transferred the power of censorship to the archbishops of Canterbury and York, so that in effect no books could be published in England without their consent. The menace of evil books was considered so great that towards the end of Elizabeth's reign it was observed that 10 sermons that were preached at St. Paul's Cross do no more for moving men to true doctrine than one of those ill books do, enticing men to ill living. In the latter years of the English Reformation, censorship actually increased with the accession of the Stuart kings, especially under the direction of Archbishop William Laud. I'm sorry, I should have shown you those pictures. There he is. There's Archbishop Laud. Archbishop Laud, in 1637, in order to control the influence of foreigners over, the English have always been concerned about foreigners in their country, and certainly seems that under Archbishop Laud that was the case. He decreed in 1637 that no books could be imported without first submitting all of their titles to the Bishop of London. Oliver Cromwell, who was certainly no friend of the church, was certainly no more tolerant than his Tudor and Stuart predecessors, and after he executed King Charles I, he extended Parliament's right to censor any publications that promoted the old Anglican order, and of course he was the person who also banned the Book of Common Prayer. Time then does not permit us to consider all of the brave men and women who continued to print books, both openly and clandestinely during this tumultuous period. But one or two brief profiles from both sides will be able to convey the sense of peril they faced. The printer-publisher Richard Grafton is responsible for some of the most important Protestant works of the English Reformation, including the Matthew Bible, the Great Bible that you were looking at up there, and the first edition of the Book of Common Prayer, printed in 1549. Grafton managed to survive through all four Tudor monarchs, which is really quite remarkable when you think about it. As King Henry VIII became more conservative in his later years, and he turned against the reforms that he had instituted, he retreated to a more explicitly Catholic roots. Grafton, however, was a committed Protestant. He didn't want to be anything except a Protestant. And so he continued printing books towards the end of Henry's reign, and as a result, he was imprisoned for printing Henry's Great Bible. So that's certainly a confusing moment. He was later released, but then he was put into prison once again for printing Lutheran works, which was probably a stupid thing to do. Then when the second Tudor, Edward VI, died suddenly in July 1553, Grafton did the stupidest thing of all. He printed that thing that you see on the right-hand side here. This is the notice which proclaimed Lady Jane Grey as the rightful heir to the throne, and he had the temerity to sign it, printer to the Queen. Of course, what happened was the real Queen came along, Mary, and he was lucky that the only thing he lost was his privilege. He was lucky under the circumstances, then he did not get executed, he survived, but he never printed again. Similar stories can be told of a variety of Protestant printers during this period, such as Reginald Wolfe, the man who had printed the first printed Tyndale's English New Testament in 1534 when it was illegal, and a man named John Day, who remained a printer, who remained in England right through the reign of Queen Mary, daring to print Protestant materials under her nose, although he did end up in the Tower for it. But he would survive. He would survive Mary, and he would print again. And the thing that he would print would arguably be the greatest piece of Protestant propaganda ever printed in the English language, Fox's Book of Martyrs. That book was found in every Protestant home until the beginning of the 20th century. For English Roman Catholic printers, the situation was equally fraught, and certainly it was far more perilous. Those who continued to pledge their allegiance to the old Church of Rome were forced to practice their faith in secret, and they became subject to increasingly severe penalties as the decades of Queen Elizabeth's reign passed. This latter group comes to be known as the recusants, and the publication of their materials, which were sympathetic to Rome, became illegal after the Queen's accession in 1558. They were perfectly honorable printers under Queen Mary. All of a sudden now, they're renegades. Domestic Catholic presses that survived, they operated clandestinely, often in the basement of people's homes, and they were often betrayed because just the very sheer fact of printing, the noise would be heard outside, and this would be enough to get the local watch come in and find out what was going on. One of my favorite stories from this period is a man named Stephen Brinkley. And Stephen Brinkley was a Catholic printer who lived just on the east side of London. What he tried to do was continue to print Catholic writings in the early years of Elizabeth's reign. He had 7 men that staffed the presses 24 hours a day, publishing pamphlets for the most part to try and counter the Protestant presses which had been licensed. He worked in these very, very cramped circumstances, but he and his men always made sure that when they went out on the street, they were dressed impeccably. Why? Because printers were known to be filthy. The black art, as they called it. You could almost never get clean. He always made sure that he and his men were clean. He would walk out in the street. The local vicar, the parish wardens would urge them to attend Anglican services, which of course they would not do because they were good Catholics. But oddly enough, it was not their non-attendance at church that got them in the end. What got them was they bought too much paper. They bought way too much paper that they could account for. And as a result of that, the neighborhood watch came. They arrested one of Brinkley's servants. He was racked. He told them where Brinkley and his men were. Brinkley moved his business, believe it or not, got the business going again, but eventually the authorities caught up with him. In 1581, he was arrested. He was tortured in the Tower of London. Miraculously, he escaped. Not sure how he did that. But most of his fellow Catholic printers who had been left in London, they were executed at Tyburn. Brinkley eventually made his way to Rome, which was typical of the English Catholic printers as Elizabeth's reign went on. Now, whether it was Catholic or Protestant, it didn't matter. The printing presses of the Reformation both created and they benefited from this emerging culture of martyrdom, because that's what's happening on both sides. The propaganda machine that emerged through the printing of woodcut engravings, like this one that you're seeing here, depicting the torture and death of the famous and the forgotten, this was very powerful in the Europe of the Reformation. Among the most famous were the images of the Protestant martyrs that you see depicted here in John Fox's Acts and Monuments, better known as Fox's Book of Martyrs. Despite the fact, and this is one of the things I find interesting about him, he was an ardent Calvinist, ardent Calvinist. And he was opposed in principle to the making of any images, because obviously it was a violation of the second commandment. Fox, nevertheless, somehow bent the rules, at least in his own mind, so that Englishmen could see the atrocities that were being committed against their fellow Protestants by the woman he came to call Bloody Mary. These were often, and we know this from wills, these were often the only images that were found in Protestant English homes. We know that they were hung in kitchen walls, and we have statements. Why? To inspire the next generation to believe. To believe. What they really were doing was inspiring the next generation to believe in an emerging mythology of a Protestant Britain that had always existed, but had never existed until just recently. Certainly, he did not include images of Catholics who had suffered similar fates under Queen Elizabeth, but of course that's the point of propaganda, isn't it? Catholic presses, of course, they had to respond in kind. They depicted the pain and the violence and the suffering endured by their co-religious at the hands of their Protestant oppressors. I think the Catholics were better at it. You can't really tell in this one, but very often in Catholic imagery, what they would do is they would show the execution, often things like disemboweling. And the people who are being executed are dressed in the contemporary dress of the day. The people who are actually doing the executions, they're dressed like Roman centurions. So it's to make a connection in the head between what is happening to their co-religionists and what happened to Christ. And you don't find that in the Protestant imagery to the same degree. Now, other one, and this one, I will warn you, this is somewhat naughty. Other propaganda that came out was scatological in the worst degree. These are by Luther. These are by Cranach. The drawings are by Cranach. Wood engravings are by Cranach. But they are based on what Luther demanded be done. And they're visceral. They're scatological, as you can see here on the right-hand side with the papal tiara and these poor peasants on the other side who obviously ate I don't know what, but felt that it was appropriate to pass wind in front of the Pope's face. These come from 1545. This is the very beginning of political cartooning. You can do a direct line from these to the cartoons that were in Charlie Hebdo 2 years ago that caused all the problems that they did. When I bought these a year and a half ago, specifically for the Reformation exhibition, and they were very expensive because there are very few of them left. And my chief librarian, when I told him that I wanted to get these, he said, "Oh, I think that's a really good idea. I think it's a really good idea." So I got them, and I said they were here, and he came over and he took a look at them. He said, "You can't show those. You can't put those up. They're going to offend people." I said, "That's the whole point. I mean, this is what Luther was trying to do. You can't tell the story of the Reformation without offending people." And then there's just the pure nonsense that comes out of this period. This is another one, the monster of Rome, another one of the famous images that comes out of the Reformation. Supposedly, the monster of Rome was found at the bottom of the Tiber after a flood in 1497, I think it is. And this was an indication that Rome was becoming corrupt. And the Protestants used this image right through the 16th century. And perhaps my favorite, these ones here. This is the monk calf on the left, 1523, and the pig priest on the right from 1553. The heads of priests and bodies of various farmyard stock combined, supposedly the result of priestly coupling with animals, which is what the Protestants said the Catholics were doing. Whatever the subject matter, we don't think of this as, our ancestors getting into this kind of thing, but they did. They did. Dirty, nasty stuff. Whatever the subject matter, such mass-produced printed images are the direct ancestors, as I say, of political cartooning. The downside of this is that what it did was it helped cause people who couldn't read, who couldn't interpret, to do the interpreting for themselves. And in both camps, it caused violent mistrust of the people on the other side, a mistrust that continues down to the present day in some places. But it has its origins in this visceral kind of representation of the opposition. The Reformation, just to conclude, was the very first revolution that occurred after the invention of the printing press. And in many ways, as I say, it was dependent on it. The revolution in communication that we are now living through today has many parallels to what happened 500 years ago. While the religious significance of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation is admittedly immense, there are also other considerations. The printing press came into its maturity, and its potential was exploited in the service of reform. What those printers unleashed 500 years ago changed religion and changed Western culture itself. And now we are living in a time when similar information and disinformation and technological revolution, arguably unlike anything that we have seen since the time of Luther himself. There's been a great deal of optimism associated with our ability to communicate with one another instantaneously, and that's something Luther would have loved, and I know he would have harnessed it, just as he helped shape the thing that we call the pamphlet. But open access and social media, yes, these are helping to democratize our world, despite the resistance that we find in places like China and North Korea and Syria. Alternative facts and fake news, these are not recent developments. Just look at the pig priest. They could be found 500 years ago. However, the difference is we now can communicate and interact instantaneously, and we can do it often without thought and certainly without editing. And that's the difference. We are becoming plagued by those who have realized that this technology can be manipulated through what one of my colleagues calls the friendly fascism of the midnight tweet. So, if we want to understand what is happening to our world today, I suggest look back 500 years to that other revolution that was caused by another emerging information technology, the Reformation in the printing press. The Reformation both made and it was made by a revolution in communications technology, and there are many parallels between it and the effects of today's new communication media. Both then and today, information has helped us to clarify, but that information has also caused us to be distorted. Access to information has definitely freed some, but it has imprisoned others. It has been used to create works of beauty, but it is also being used to summon people to immense acts of violence. The ambiguity both then and now lies in the fact that information can be manipulated and spread very easily. It can both build up a culture, but it can also destroy it, as the history of the Reformation demonstrates. Where the information revolution of today is going to take us, for better or for worse, I don't know. That's the job of someone else to explain, I hope, 500 years from now. Thanks very much. If they're, whatever they want. I'm sure they want to eat and drink.
Questions or queries or whatever. A couple minutes of that.
And then you eat and drink.
And I go out and
Sure.
schlep it in.
That the joke ones that you bought, the very expensive ones?
Joke ones. Luther would not be happy with you saying that.
Are you allowed to tell us what you would have paid for that?
The chief librarian generally says that we're not supposed to discuss money. It was a lot. It was a. It's because there are only 9 sets of those left known in the world. So I can tell you it was less than 100,000. Which for things when you only have 9 left, it wasn't a bad price. And you know how they survived? Interestingly enough, I don't think you can tell from the way because I cropped them. I think. No, you can't tell, unfortunately. How they survived was they were turned upside down. You know when you open a book, you have the what's called the paste down at the front? So these survived because they've been turned upside down and they've been used as the paste downs. And they were only discovered in the late 20th century because the book fell apart, the paste downs came away, and they were able to see that these were underneath. So. Oh, it could easily have gone into the trash. Yeah, it could easily have gone into the trash. So that's from Vienna. That's from a dealer in Vienna. Yeah, in Libris. Yes.
My husband inherited a couple of books called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
Oh yes.
And they're all
Gibbon. Yeah.
And there's like tissue paper between each page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's still.
What period are yours from?
I can't read all the X's.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's certainly it's one of the most popular books of the late 18th and 19th centuries for sure. Yeah, absolutely. It was on the Index of Forbidden Books as well at one point. Yeah.
But what you're describing is what's happening a lot now.
Well, this is what we there's nothing new under the sun, as Ecclesiastes. So it's the things that we are seeing with the modern technologies. There's one of my again colleagues at the university. He maintains, and I think he's right. The revolution that I'm talking about here in the Reformation, without the printing press, could not have happened the way that it did, and it changed the Western world, as we very well know. He is saying that there has been nothing since Gutenberg until now that even comes close to having the ramifications of that first revolution. The problem is we are living in it. And as a result, we aren't going to be able to be the ones to say it's going to be for someone 100 years from now to look back and say, this is what happened in the late 20th, early 21st century, and there's been nothing like it in the previous 500 before that. It's remarkable that we're living through it. It's a little scary that we're living through it too. Yeah.
A lot of what you've talked about here, how much of the original printed works and the pamphlets in particular were consumed in groups of people? Like you alluded to these being coffee shops and
they were
public meeting places. And so much of what we're getting today is consumed in isolation.
That's right. It's a very different situation. It's very, very true. Those pamphlets we know because in Wittenberg, literacy would probably be about 5%. It's effectively a rural community. We know, and because there were complaints from the city elders and all across Europe, we don't want you reading these things in bars. People were taking parts of the scripture and reading it in bars and talking about it in bars because they weren't while they were drinking, because they weren't getting necessarily any kind of exposition of the scripture in the churches. And we know that this was happening, and this is part of the way that, but because there were more copies that were available, it meant you could get it to more bars and more all sorts of places. Whereas if you couldn't read it, someone could read it to you, and they were. Henry and Edward VI, well, it probably was his advisors. The pair of them got very upset about the fact that people were doing these things in taverns. It drove them crazy. But we also know that they were doing it in the backs of churches, so that the church service would be going on at the front, and people would be at the back having little studies amongst themselves and ignoring what was going on. They had to be in church because the law said they had to be in church, but they could be at the back with someone reading other stuff to them. So it was an interesting time. I'm glad I didn't live through it, in all honesty. I think it would have been...
Yeah, but if you're going to have a revolution, that starts in the bars, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
It
yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
start with me sitting on my cell phone.
Yeah, no, exactly. And this is different. This is much more individualistic, whereas the what happened because of the Reformation was a communitarian thing. Now, you wonder, it was interesting last week, I think it was, when after that horrible shooting in Florida, and there were some articles in the New York Times about why is this different? Is it possible this could be different? I mean, most of us are thinking nothing's going to be different. But someone's made one really interesting point, and they said it's young people who understand the power of social media who might make a difference this time. It has nothing to do with their elders. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Because then it has gone back to the communitarian.
Years after the printing press, when you start to see people realize
That's
the
right.
power of it.
That's right. And who knows, maybe because the information here is more instantaneous, I don't know if it's going to be quicker, but we're certainly seeing something happen that I hope is going to end up being good. I hope it's good. But the problem is there is a lot of disinformation, and they had it here. As I say, the pig priest and all that kind of stuff, that was fake news. When people get upset about it, you sort of say, yeah, it's always been around. But I'm surprised at how inexpert we are sometimes in looking at something and saying, that can't be true. That just isn't true.
Critical consumers.
And this is what they're one of the among the points of this is that at the time of the Reformation, one of the things that happened was that there was a process of editing where something happened, something was stated, people would sit down and read it, people would sit down and revise it, and then it would, a formal. That isn't happening now. Now any witless idiot can put something out and it's deemed to be truth. It's a dangerous thing. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your talk.
Oh, you're
Really
welcome.
appreciate it. You didn't get to the old King James Bible.
No, I have a whole other thing on the King James Bible.
I believe that's the most widely printed book in all of history.
It's still considered, the best. As far as I know, it still has the rank as the. I think maybe it gets fudged now because I think now they say the Bible is the bestseller, the greatest bestseller in history. So of course there are so many versions now, but certainly the King James certainly was until until the mid 20th century for sure.
When the new King James came out.
Yeah.
others did.
Well, and then you had the Revised Standard Version, which effectively is takes the King James as its basic text and then moves along from there. So, yeah. Now we did a big thing in 2011 for the 400th anniversary of the King James. Yeah.
You might want to give if there's a website to do with your job on the research.
Oh, you just go on to Google the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library and see all the stuff that's going on. We're the largest rare book library in Canada. It's a great place. So just Google it and take a look.
The other thing I did was I liked it on Facebook too, and that way
Thank you.
you see all the exhibits and special events that are coming up.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things.
There's a lot of stuff. We got an exhibition right now of the photographs of Allen Ginsberg. So it's quite a shift going from the print of the Reformation to Allen Ginsberg photographs. Some of them, anyway, yeah.
Not as good as those, eh?
Well, some of them get pretty darn close to that, yeah.
One of the other things at the Fisher Rare Book Room is the one time you had us down and you showed us some of these very old Bibles. That was really
Oh yeah, we have copies of the Scripture. Our oldest copy of the Scripture is a 10th century, obviously manuscript copy of the Torah in Hebrew. We have huge too. It's not a scroll, which is interesting. It's a volume. We have a copy of the Greek New Testament of the Greek Gospels, the four Gospels, dating from 1040, I think it is 1040, illuminated. And then all these we have all the major ones of the English Reformation as well. The great Coverdale, Matthew, Bishops, Geneva, Dewey, Reams, Tyndale. We have all of those. Yeah. So bring the congregation down sometime. We can do a little tour of the Bible.
That's what I was thinking too, if they have a place they can see upcoming events.
Oh sure, yeah.
People are aware and can
Yeah.
fit them into their
Absolutely.
schedule.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think we can give a very sincere, great amount of
Thank you very much. Thank you.
said,